XCOM UFO Defense, or UFO Enemy Unknown depending on where you bought it, the game that changed the turn-based strategy genre forever and has, oh god, inspired who knows how many titles, was actually cancelled during its development. And amazingly, the creator of XCOM himself, Julian Gollop, only found out about this something like 20 years after the fact. Today, on this week's episode of Here's a Thing, we're going to tell a story about how 3 people disobeyed direct instructions to scrap what is one of the best games ever made, and somehow kept its development going in secret. Now, the original XCOM had always been kind of difficult to pitch. That ends up being a fairly important part of this story, as you'll see. In fact, when the Gollop brothers, Julian and Nick, approached the game's publisher Microprose in the early 90s, it looked nothing like the game you'll recognise today. They'd brought along a demo for a sequel to a game they'd already made called Laser Squad, and although the Microprose UK team saw some potential in what they played, this wasn't the game they wanted. You see, the UK team at Microprose had aspirations to take on their US counterparts who were about to ship a little game you may have heard of called Sid Meier's Civilization. And yeah, this team in the UK were fed up of being known as the toy division within the company. They wanted a bigger project. They wanted something that could stand side by side with Civ. And so the Gollops are told, yeah, your demo's not bad, but if we're going to publish this, we want something that's set on Earth. That's important to Microprose right now. It'll need some kind of extensive research system to it with, I don't know, maybe something like, you know, that Civilopedia that the other guys are doing. Why not get something like that in your game? And if you're going to make a strategy game, let's give it some real depth too. That's going to be key. Oh, and one other thing, said Pete Moreland, who was one of the top guys at the time at Microprose UK. I used to be really into Gray Anderson's UFO. You know that TV show from the Thunderbirds fella? Yeah, well, why don't you make this game about an alien invasion instead? That right there is genuinely the origin story behind XCOM, and to Gollop's credit, he's not ashamed to admit that it was Microprose, in fact, that gave him and his brother the ambition to make something bigger, something grander. Without those initial conversations, they would have quite happily gone on to make Laser Squad 2 instead. And a quick side note here as well, it was the design team at Microprose that came up with the name Extraterrestrial Combat Force, or XCOM for short. Anyway, development begins, and those paying closest attention to the project quickly suspect this might end up being something a little bit special. Moreland, who I spoke to last week, recalls the first time he saw a playable version of the game in which soldiers could move vertically from one level to another and gain a height advantage over their enemies by doing so. Yeah, this is maybe gonna be a hit, he reckoned. But remember I said that XCOM was sometimes a difficult game to pitch. Although the game systems on an individual basis weren't all that complex, when you brought them all together and tried to explain how that would work to someone unfamiliar with the game, it was confusing. And in Gollop's own words, his design document, and he wasn't used to making them, was just a bit crap. And that didn't help either. Which meant when Microprose's CEO and major shareholder Wild Bill Steely, I love that name, sold his shares to a company called Spectrum Holobyte in 1993, XCOM was suddenly in trouble. Spectrum Holobyte was at the time known best for its flight simulator games. It didn't really get the strategy genre. It certainly didn't get this newfangled turn-based tactical game with its time units and its geoscape and its tendency to have the player become far too emotionally attached to the soldiers under their command before inevitably watching them die. A meeting was called between Spectrum Holobyte and the top brass at Microprose UK, namely Adrian Parr, Pete Moreland and Paul Hibbard, or as I like to call them, the Guardians of XCOM. In this meeting, it was decided, as they looked through a big portfolio of games currently in development, which ones should continue being developed and which ones should be canned. At this point in time, XCOM had just gone into internal testing, and although it was just about playable, it wasn't in great condition. Spectrum Holobyte very quickly made a decision. The game was to be cancelled with immediate effect. Parr, Moreland and Hibbard each made their case for why XCOM was still worth the investment, as did the team handling the internal testing at the time, but these pleas fell upon deaf ears, and so Microprose UK did what it had to do. It agreed to pull the plug on XCOM. Except not quite. As Spectrum Holobyte returned to the States, a second meeting was called, and this time it's just Parr, Moreland and Hibbard. In the meeting, the 3 of them decide to keep the game's development going despite the quite clear instructions they've just been given that say otherwise. It was time for the toy division to make its name. Now, the really useful thing about hiding XCOM from the company's shareholders is there was actually a reasonably low-cost project. Aside from Julian and Nick Gollop, who worked remotely, there were only a couple of full-time artists working on the project, and only one of those worked in the Microprose office every day. So, if someone from Spectrum Holobyte did visit, it wasn't very obvious that the game was still in the works. And interestingly, it was also decided at this stage to withhold the game's cancellation from the game's creators themselves. In fact, they'd only find out what happens some 20 years later while Julian was preparing for a talk he was giving at GDC on the making of XCOM. I asked Pete Mullen about that decision, and here's what he told me. Well, you can imagine how soul-destroying that would have been to them at the time because they were going hell for leather at it. Great expression there. So, we decided not to tell them. So yes, development continued and the secret was kept safe, even from the Gollops, until eventually Spectrum Holobyte found itself facing a bit of a problem. You see, a game it was about to ship fell through at the last moment, meaning that it was about to release a fairly disappointing quarterly financial report. Spectrum Holobyte needed a game to ship, and it needed it pretty quickly. Obviously, the Microprose UK team are made very aware of this, and they figure, you know what, it's probably not a bad moment to break the news. So, remember that game you told us to cancel? Yeah, well, we didn't, and also it's not that far away from completion. We could even, if you like, have it finished in time to ensure those financial numbers end up looking pretty good. And Spectrum Holobyte was not mad. In fact, it was delighted. Not only would this fill a gap in the release schedule, which they needed to fill, the game was actually looking pretty fantastic. Who would have thought it? As a result, the team is given roughly 3 months to complete their work, which involves some punishing time in crunch mode for everyone involved, but they do hit the deadline, and the rest is, well, history. According to our royalty statements, Gollop told me over Skype, we sold around 500,000 copies. And let's be honest, that doesn't even account for how many people actually played the game. It was distributed much more widely than that by various means, most of which aren't strictly what you call legal. But yeah, the original XCOM changed video games forever, and so it blows my mind to know just how close this game came to being scrapped entirely. A flippant, or at least naive decision on the behalf of a new shareholder that didn't really understand the strategy genre almost meant we lost one of the most important strategy games there is. And so, as thankful as I am to Julian and Nick Gollop for the impact they've had on the types of video games I love to play, it's important to also give some credit to those that protected them. Adrian Parr, Pete Mullen, and Paul Hibbard, the guardians of XCOM. Cheers for that. Also, the game was cancelled. Did you know? Have you heard that as well? It was crazy.
No?
Yeah, the Julian only found out about it about 4 years ago, but the game was cancelled mid-development, and no one told Julian, and they kept it hidden from their shareholders. XCOM wouldn't have ever happened, which is a
Oh my
terrifying
god,
thought.
that's awesome!
Yeah,
So they were trying to chase civilization.
yeah. That was the plan.
Look, that chase continues
Continues.
today. I know exactly what that's like. Those
Okay.
fuckers with all their success and yeah.
And cheers for watching this week's episode of Here's a Thing. I hope you liked it. If you did, do let us know why in the comments below. And yeah, this show happens every 2 weeks, so you can check back in roughly 14 days, or exactly 14 days, which is 2 weeks, to see the next episode. And if you haven't watched any of this before, here are a couple of recent examples that we have done. There is Why Dwarf Fortress Started Killing Cats, not quite as weird as it sounds, but pretty weird. And Why We All Caught Pokemon Wrong, which involves quite a lot of maths. So yeah, cool. Thank you for watching. Finally did one on XCOM. That's nice. And I'll see you next time.